Welcome everyone to our first webinar on overcoming the challenges that internal comms faces in the tech industry. We'll have around 30 minutes worth of content, excluding questions, coming to you from a unique combination of two high-level speakers on employee engagement and internal communications. After I introduce our two speakers, we'll be talking about the tipping point. When does a company need internal comms? We'll then talk about the benefit of centrality in your approach to internal comms, after which we move to cover the three most frequent challenges to internal comms in the tech industry. Moving on, we'll give you 6 tooltips that help you overcome those challenges, and then we end it with a part that I like to call the juicy bit. Here, our speakers will inspire you with their vast experience and answer the question of how IC can drive business value in tech and beyond. At the end, we'll endeavor to answer the questions that you are able to type up throughout this webinar. Now I can move on to introduce our speakers. As it's always ladies first, it's my pleasure to introduce Natalie Allen to you all. Natalie is the head of employee engagement at ZPG, home to Zoopla and Uswitch. She has dedicated the past 6 years of her career to making the working day more meaningful, rewarding, and enjoyable for employees by connecting them to their customers, their brand, and to one another. Previously at AXA, Natalie has a breadth of knowledge and experience in internal comms, corporate social responsibility, employee engagement, and internal events across both the financial services landscape and the tech industry. In her current role, Natalie has supported the growth of ZPG through merger and acquisition activity, as well as the recent transition of the business from public trading to private equity. In a climate of constant fluidity and ever-increasing expectations of the employee experience, Natalie understands the importance of sustainability and scalability in all aspects of an employee engagement strategy and the value that carefully considered tools and processes can provide. Our second speaker is a man familiar to most people within internal comms and the author of the research series, The Present and Future of Internal Comms. I'm of course talking about industry veteran Mike Klein and the only other male voice on this broadcast. Mike is a Netherlands-based internal communications consultant with extensive experience as a practitioner, researcher, and advocate within the internal communications discipline. A former political consultant in the US, Mike has overseen and executed polls, surveys, and communication projects for more than 20 years, working with large corporates like Cargill, Maersk, Shell, and Avery Dennison. He's the author of From Lincoln to LinkedIn, the 55-minute guide to social communication, and has been regional chair of IABC in Europe, Middle East, and North Africa since 2018. Through his consultancy, Changing the Terms, Mike works with corporates, startups, and nonprofits on internal and external communication challenges. From large organizations to smaller teams within those organizations, Mike has seen it all. Lastly, I'll be your host. My name is Jonathan Davis, and I'm Happio's resident internal communications journalist. Since this isn't about me at all, we're going to get straight down to business. Natalie, talk to us about the tipping point. When do companies absolutely need internal comms?
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for the intro. Hi, everybody. So I guess I just really want to start by taking a moment to define exactly what we mean by internal communications, because for me, this isn't just about top-down dissemination of information. This is about two-way communications and conversations that flow throughout the veins of your business. So that's top-down, bottom-up, peer-to-peer. And very often it's more about what you do and how you do it than it is about what you say. So I think I just wanted to sort of set some context around what we mean by internal comms when we're talking about that during the webinar. In terms of the tipping point, so you may have heard of the rule of 150, which was coined by British anthropologist Robin Dunbar. And Robin talked about the fact that when we get to numbers of 150 or more, suddenly the cohesion and connections between people in the business start to break down. And that's really when you see groups starting to split off and messages quite quickly become diluted and communication can really slow down. So if we're talking purely about numbers, I would say probably 150 is about the point where you're going to start to get some issues for your communications. But if we think about the working world today, you know, people are split geographically in different locations, and that in itself can create this tipping point. As soon as you have people in more than one location, you need to start looking at technology to help improve your communications. Face-to-face is obviously the preference. It's the most effective communication, but it's not as effective when you're looking at scalability.
Just a quick question for you, Natalie. How many
Sure.
employees did ZPG have before they decided to bring in a dedicated IC expert? In their case, you.
Yeah, so actually we were at about 750, so quite a bit more than the 150 that I've just mentioned there.
Well, the reason I ask is, if you look at the overall picture of internal comms in organizations, next slide, um, until the last few years, only large companies invested in internal communication. Really, you're looking at, a few companies in the 1,000+ category. More companies, once you got past 5,000+, tended to have dedicated internal comms resource. And that's important because internal communication is a fundamentally different discipline than public relations or other communication disciplines because of its focus on the way employees interact with each other, in addition to the way employees interact with the brand and with the organization as a whole. That's a critical distinction because public relations is much more transactional. Internal communications is much more based around relationships both within the organization and with the organization as a whole. And technology, and particularly the kind of technology that we're talking about tonight, offers organizations the ability to scale downwards as well as upwards. So this type of technology makes internal communication relevant and actionable for companies well below 1,000 employees, really getting to that 150 employee tipping point that Natalie mentions. Um, the key value internal communications provides to any organization, but particularly to a dispersed organization, is something that's called centrality. And by centrality, I mean the ability to use authoritative, reliable, accessible channels and platforms to drive clarity, alignment, and prioritization.
All right, Mike and Natalie, thank you both for this introduction. In the research that Mike has been doing, we've noticed three particular challenges to internal comms in tech: employee retention, the ownership of internal comms, and internal comms' unique ability to bridge the two-letter departments together. Natalie will kick it off by telling us, in her experience, the impact great internal comms can have on employee retention.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I mean, I just want to pick up on one of the points that Mike just mentioned there around how good internal comms can create a sense of cohesion within the business, a sense of direction, helping your employees to prioritize, to give them a sense of purpose, and to also give them a sense of connection. And of course, all of these things are really critical to employee engagement, which ultimately leads to retention. And so is making sure that everybody in your business feels that they have a voice. And so, as I mentioned earlier, this sort of two-way communication, this conversation is really key in terms of the theme. And so it's important, particularly in the tech industry, that when you're looking at creating a more strategic approach to internal comms through tools, through platforms, processes, that they really focus on, first of all, removing friction for your employees and making collaboration much, much easier for colleagues. And that's largely because the tools are the most successful. The tools that are the most successful, are the ones that are user-led and that support authenticity in your communications. It needs to feel organic. It needs to feel collaborative, not forced, sort of top down. Good internal communications in terms of retention should really feel like it's an enabler for your business.
All right. And then, Natalie, in previous conversations that we've had, you've touched upon the point of ownership in internal comms. So where does that department sit? In your research, Mike, in your research, this has been kind of a hot point for debate. What's your vision on this?
Well, I guess the whole issue of ownership of internal communications is a massive hot button with a lot of internal communications people. But the reason why it's a hot button is because the way organizations or teams functions within an organization come to own internal communications is often not given a lot of thought at all. Usually the ownership is by default. What happens is at some point, an organization decides to set up an internal communications function or hire an expert. And then the choice is usually one of two options. It's either HR because it's about people, or it's PR because it's about using communication tactics. But rarely is the choice between the two aligned with the mission of what the organization is trying to drive, communicate, and deliver on. It rarely reports to the CEO, although those I've spoke to who do report either directly or indirectly to the CEO think that it's a real benefit to have that access and involvement. But from my experience, the most successful IC experiences I've seen and I've heard about have been when the stakeholder who has the biggest internal agenda has, by and large, ownership of the internal comms function. So if it's in a change situation, the chief transformation officer could be a great owner for internal communication. If it's an organization that's really focusing on retention and on accelerating the growth of its human resources, HR may actually be the natural choice. If it's an organization that is really trying to get better control of how it uses its resources, a CFO can be often an excellent sponsor for internal communications, partially because they're really awesome at having a big picture on what the value of things is. So they don't necessarily make as many demands on internal communication to justify the value it brings to the business. But the key thing is when you've got an owner who has an agenda that's driving the business, internal communications can add a lot of value to that ownership structure and to the owner as well.
All right, and then we've talked about those several departments, that the two-letter departments, as I like to call them, that IC is sort of uniquely positioned to bridge into. How do we feel about, well, the role that internal comms can play as that bridge?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly from my point of view, I think that, when we're looking at HR and IT teams, when it comes to internal communications, they've really got shared ownership for the digital workspaces and platforms that your business use. And so it's really important that they're in sync when it comes to your internal comms strategy. And all of the things that enable your business to communicate and collaborate with one another. So the HR team may be the ones that own setting the vision for the culture, but this can only really come to life if the ways that we work and interact with each other reflect that culture. So, for example, we can't be a fast-paced business if we've got slow, clunky tools and platforms that we use, and we can't be collaborative if we're not all using the same cloud-based software. So I think there's a real connection there between those two teams in particular. But actually, all shared services teams within a business have an impact on the employee experience. And in much the same way that we would expect our sales and marketing teams to be completely aligned with, say, our product design and UX teams, the shared services within a business need to be aligned on creating that employee experience. And one that matches the story that we're trying to tell about our business and who we are, because otherwise, you're at risk really of what we're saying and what we're doing being two entirely different things.
It's interesting that you mentioned shared services as well, because one of the things that I'm seeing in a lot of bigger organizations is that they are outsourcing or offshoring fundamental services, not just customer service helpline and IT helplines, but functional support to locations that are often physically removed from the other activities in the business. And internal communications could be a critical link to keeping those people, in places like Bulgaria, Philippines, India, engaged with the overall mission, the overall perspective, and the overall needs of the organization on a day-to-day rolling basis.
Okay, so we've tackled a couple of very strategical challenges, and now we want to give our audience a couple of very practical tools that they can use to overcome these challenges. Both Natalie and Mike have lined up free tools of their choice as internal comms weaponry, so to say. Natalie, why don't you start telling us about your first tool?
Sure, thank you. So these are really based on the internal comms focus that we've had at ZPG over the last few years. The first one probably seems quite basic, but it has been fundamental for us as a business in building the right foundations for everything else that we've been able to kind of add on afterwards. And so my first tool is G Suite. This was something that we migrated the whole of the business across to in 2017. Being a business who's grown exponentially, mainly from merger and acquisition activity, we found that we had lots of legacy systems that people were using. And so we had no single secure way of being able to share information. I'm just getting a little bit of feedback on the audio there. I don't know if anyone else is getting that, but Mike, if you could pop yourself on mute, I don't know if that might help. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. That's gone away now. So this was, like I say, quite a basic thing for us, but it was, not to be underestimated in terms of the change shift that it required for the business. A lot of people had never used Google before. They'd been using Microsoft since the beginning of their respective organizations. Not quite sure what happened with the audio then, but hopefully you can hear me again. So as I was saying, a lot of our business were using Microsoft historically for a long period of time, and so we had to do business transformation sessions with a lot of people to help them through that change curve, and that involved essentially mapping out the day-to-day processes that teams were using, how they communicated with each other, how they worked together, and seeing how they could be transformed by using G Suite. And as a result, we've had massive increase in collaboration across the business and a single place that we can share information securely, like with our business updates that we do monthly with our CEO. We didn't have a single place that we could share that instantly with people, but now that is possible. So that's been a big step forward for us as a business. And the second tool that I have here is Slack. So most of you have probably heard of Slack. So this is the kind of instant messenger platform of choice for most tech teams, particularly in startup businesses and smaller companies. Our experience of Slack is that it's not really something that we own as a communication platform as such. It's not centrally owned. Not all of our business are using it, so it just tends to be the tech and product teams. And for that reason, we haven't used it as our primary communication channel, and I don't really think it's one that you can ever use as that, because it is very, very user-led, and it's completely self-managed. So it's very much like social media. It's a very informal channel. It's great for personalization, for visibility, and we find that most of our teams just crack on with it. They create the channels that they need for a particular project or for a particular team collaboration. You can set up company-wide channels to feed news in. That's definitely possible on there, but it's very much kind of an instant messaging tool rather than anything else. And the final one is Happeo, which we decided to introduce at ZPG last year. It's the first single digital workspace or intranet that we've had in the business, and we went through a really careful process of selecting the right tool for us. There were lots of criteria that we had before we went ahead with Happeo, but the main thing really for us was that we had full integration with G Suite, and it meant that we were able to bring everything together all in one place for people. We had dynamic content that wasn't cumbersome to upload or update, and really it's the next generation in intranet for us. It mimics that self-serve experience that all of us have as consumers externally, with powerful search features, and there's lots of opportunity for two-way conversation within that. So it's not just static content, it's not just push information, it's very interactive and really dynamic. So that works really well for us.
Fantastic, Natalie. Thank you very much for your tool tips. We're going to move on to Mike's free tools of choice with the first one, Circle. Mike, take it away. I think we're just having a tiny bit of audio problems on Mike's line. Please give us one moment.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. No worries, Mike. Yes, everyone can hear you. You can go ahead.
Okay, well, before I talk about the tools that I recommend, I've been having conversations with over 30 internal communications practitioners around the world for the research I'm doing on the present and future of internal communication. And a number of very interesting tools have come up in those conversations. The first is something called Circle. And what's interesting about Circle is there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence as a concept of internal communication. But Circle turns that from a concept into an actual practical tool that pretty much any internal communicator or even any communicator could put to use for them. It's artificial intelligence powered. It enables and it drives personalized communication between the organization and the individuals who use it. What it does is it combines employee preferences that are stated with employee behaviors in terms of which content the employee rejects or engages with. And it also enables automated curation of internal content and the blending of relevant external content. And this is particularly important for smaller organizations, which may just have a part-time dedicated resource, because this can add relevant information to your content flow without adding workload or expense to your organization. So with the automated personalization, Circle reduces labor requirements while increasing relevance and engagement for each employee. So that's Circle. The second tool I'd mention is something called Talk Freely. And I would mention this particularly if, even if you see the benefits of G Suite, your organization, your IT department is not prepared to take the organization down that transformation at this time. There's no reason not to start now, but there's also no reason to start with a more central approach to internal comms, even if you can't get them to pull the trigger on G Suite. And a tool I've been talking with a number of people with is called Talk Freely. And what it is it's a mobile-first internal comms app that works across different platforms, mobile, desktop, and tablets. And it really combines a suite of news, social groups, and additional tools that allow for a centrality-based approach to internal communication. The final tool I wanted to mention, and this is an important tool because there's a lot of talk about email going away, or a lot of talk among internal communicators about how email is out of date or irrelevant or irritating. The fact is, email isn't going away. And Contact Monkey is one of a number of tools that allows you to send, track, and create, send, and track personalized internal emails within Outlook. So you can see the overall campaign performance. You can look at performance at an individual employee or an individual department level using existing distribution lists from Outlook. And it also includes features like social reactions, pulse surveys, star ratings, and other ways so that you could actually get some very valuable numbers that can drive your email-based communication approaches.
All right. Thank you both for your tooltips. So just to summarize, we've talked about the tipping point and we've showed the three challenges to internal comms in the tech industry. And now we've given you the tools that will help you overcome them. So practicality aside, we want to leave you, our audience, with a sense of inspiration or even renewed confidence in the impact that you can have on your organization with your internal comms endeavors. So it's time to get to the juicy bit. Natalie, tell us, what does ZPG do to drive business value through internal comms?
Yeah, so I mean, as I mentioned previously, for us, internal communications is a massive driver of employee engagement, which, as we know, is connected with business value, retention, etc. But specifically on our internal communication approach, we've really focused on scalability and sustainability, and also driving productivity and collaboration throughout the business. And there's three sort of examples of that I wanted to share with you today. So one of them is around activating communicators throughout the business. So rather than just one person having the sole responsibility for the communications that happen throughout the business, is finding the experts in the business that have things that they want to share with others and giving them the platform to be able to do that. So a great example is our home track business, who deal in reams and reams of property data and insights, that now have a platform and a way to share those insights with other people throughout the business that helps drive, decisions around product developments and all sorts of different things. So that's the first one, is around finding the communicators in the business that are experts, that want to have a voice and want to share their ideas and their views with others. The second one for us was around integration. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't have, if we were going to have an intranet, for example, that we didn't have something that was going to be cumbersome, that meant that we needed to keep versions of policies and documents and upload them separately, and that we also had to consider the security around. And so for us, integration with G Suite was really key. That means we have dynamic content that's self-serve as well. The search feature that we have is so important to us, because we wanted to make it easy for people to access those documents and that information quickly. So things like company policies, applying for benefits, information and company updates, as I mentioned before, it's all in one place. We know it's secure because it's linked to G Suite and it's easy for people to find. And then the third thing is around having an iterative and user-led approach. So getting the buy-in from employees on what we're doing with our internal comms. So when we launched our intranet, we did that in phases. We went out with the first phase. We asked people what they wanted. We had focus groups. We involved them in the content creation. And we were really transparent about the process being iterative. It's not going to be perfect the first time you see it. We will build on it, and we'll work together to do that. And I think that really helps to just maintain that sense of personalization with whatever you're doing with your internal comms within your business.
All right, Mike, how can effective internal comms drive business value more broadly?
That's a really good question, Jonathan, and I think it comes down to 5 different but all related concepts. I think the most important thing is that internal communication can drive prioritization and alignment. A lot of the struggle, a lot of the waste, a lot of the challenge facing organization is when people are dealing with ambiguity, and they deal with ambiguity in different ways at the same time, working towards slightly different objectives, working towards different agendas, not being sure of what they're being asked to do, or thinking that they're sure of what they're being asked to do, when in fact it differs from what the actual agenda is. So internal communication could drive a lot of value by keeping people reasonably on the same page without necessarily driving micromanagement. Second, internal communication can stimulate conversation and participation. And with tools like the ones we've discussed here, can do it within the organizational firewall, in addition to having it appear where it normally appears in places like Facebook and Glassdoor and other external venues. You can't shut down those venues. It makes no sense to shut down those venues. But having a central platform that provides centrality and cohesion of the organization can definitely stimulate conversation and participation. And by strengthening cohesion, you're also reducing pressure on management, because a lot of organizations in the old model used to hire a lot of managers to keep people on the same page. And the question is, with managers, the tasks that are facing managers today are absolutely immense, and the demands that are placed on them are immense. Basically, what we're asking them to be is a combination of Jack Welch in terms of business acumen, Dalai Lama in terms of empathy, Gandhi in terms of conflict resolution, and Churchill in terms of strategic brilliance. And these are massive expectations placed on people who've by and large been functional specialists as opposed to people with actual formal management training. And so reducing the pressure on them in any way will certainly help improve their performance and create more coherence around what they do. Finally, and this is also a critical piece and something that will be the subject of the next Happeo report on the present and future of internal communication, is measuring organizational traction, being able to track, support, and drive momentum in the business from a central platform.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much. Well, there you have it. Never underestimate the power of high-level internal comms and the value that this drives towards business. Now, we've given you the chance to come up with questions in the meantime, so now we will answer them. And we have quite a few that came in. I'm going to start with the first one. I saw. Mike, this one is for you. Mike, would you see email as an effective channel for priority messages to staff? So, for example, advising of imminent system outages.
It depends on which staff. If you've got office-based staff, email can be a wonderful channel and still is a wonderful channel for a lot of office-based staff communication. But when you've got production staff, when you've got retail staff, when you've got field staff making calls in the field, it may not be the most effective tool. It's most questions about internal communications strategy are best answered with the stock answer for economists, which is it depends. But that much being said, email is not past its sell-by date when it comes to delivering specific direct messages to people who have instant access to email.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And then we have a question for Natalie. This one's from Helen. How did you turn internal comms into what was already a very large business? It must have been difficult to get a good overview of a company of 750 people.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly focus groups and champions, I would say, helps enormously. I was very lucky in the sense that the entire leadership team, including the CEO, was very bought into the value of internal comms within our business, and I think that's half of the battle, really, in the role that we do, is to try and convince the business of the value that it can add. And so through that enabled me to have access to champions, as I say, representatives from around the business. I did a lot of touring of all of the offices, went and met a lot of people, just got out into the business as much as I possibly could. And as I say, ended up with that network of people that I could sort of use to soundboard ideas, involve in focus groups, and get some really useful feedback from.
Fantastic. And I actually have another one for you, so I hope you have a bottle of water ready next to you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so self-service keeps popping up in my conversations, and it probably seems a bit basic, but can you give an overview of this? How do you strike a balance well, and how concerned should you be with engagement?
How concerned should you be with engagement in terms of the connection to engagement and self-service, or?
I'm guessing yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's one of those things. I think you can't make somebody engaged, right? I think you can provide all of the right enablers for that to happen, and you can empower people to be engaged. But there's an element of, you can only lead a horse to water. People have to meet you halfway. People have to be willing to, for example, if giving people a clear sense of strategy is one of the main enablers of engagement, you have to have people in the business that want to know about the strategy, that are hungry for that information. And I think it's a real combination of the two. But it's a little bit chicken and egg, because I think a lot of businesses are quite far behind in terms of matching the consumer experience to the internally with the employee experience. And so we've just created this culture for ourselves where I think a lot of employees expect to be approached with certain things rather than go out and find the information for themselves. So we've got a little bit of way to go, I think, to tip that balance until we start to build those cultures where, you know, people do come into a business and just expect to be able to find stuff on their intranet as easily as they would find it on Google. So I think it's a combination of both. Hopefully that answers your question.
Well, it seems like a great answer to me. Jill, you were the one to ask a question. If you have a follow-up question, please let us know. For now, we've got 2 remaining questions. Mike, I'm going to switch this one over to you because it's really interesting, actually. This one pertains to the research that you've done and a conversation that we've had recently. In all of the technology that we named, introducing tech is great, but who should have ownership of it? Is that going to be IT or is that going to be IC?
Well, IC should definitely make a bid to own the ownership wherever it's possible and fight for it if necessary. Because what often happens is you get into provide and pray mode otherwise. That IT introduces a tool, it ticks the box of delivering the tool, internal comms has other tasks and priorities that it has to deliver on. There are very few internal comms departments with a huge amount of surplus time. So if they don't own the task, it's often very difficult for them to take over the adoption task otherwise. So the key thing is if you're an internal communicator, it's also incumbent on you to recognize the magnitude of the challenge, which is that the tool's adoption will determine not only your fate as an internal communicator, but the fate of internal communications in your organization. If the tool fails, most organizations aren't going to go and replace it with a better tool. They will learn how to live without the tool and probably not get another tool of its type for some time because the backstory was, we tried this once, it failed, it's a waste of time and money, we'll just keep doing it the way we normally do it. And it's your job to make sure that that doesn't happen. Otherwise, you're at risk of even potentially carrying the can for failure, even if you don't have the official responsibility for delivering success.
Amazing. And actually, we received 2 of the same questions recently, one from Ian and one follow-up question from Dale. And they both basically relate to the rule of 150 that we spoke of. So I'm just going to read this one out. If companies have their staff spread over more than one site, does the 150 employee threshold still hold true?
Do you want me to take a stab at that?
Yeah, go for it, Mike. Yeah.
I think the Dunbar number, it's an interesting number. It's a number really about social relationships and proximity. And I think Dunbar's assumption is that there's a reasonable amount of proximity within that group of 150. It doesn't mean that they all have to be in the same place, but they all have to have some degree of detailed interactions with each other to have that level of cohesion. The reality in organizations is that of the 150, not all of them are really communicating directly with any more than 1 or 2 people anyways. Salespeople are more likely to communicate with customers than they are with a large number of internal staff. And so it depends on the function of your organization. I've done a lot of work with organizational network analysis, and it'd be useful when you reach the point of 150 to do a basic network analysis and see who's talking to whom. If everything is fully connected, you may be able to get by for another couple of years without bringing full-blown IC into the picture. But if you've got a whole number of disconnected employees at 150, it's only going to get worse after you pass 150.
Yeah, I agree with Mike completely. And I think really the point in us talking about that was really just to illustrate the fact that, particularly on the proximity issue that Mike's talking about there, if it's not 150 people all in one office, then you really are going to have to think about how technology enables the communication of your business. Even if you don't at that point decide that it's the right thing to have somebody specifically owning it, you need to have the technology that enables your business still to connect with one another.
Fantastic. Thank you both. I have a tiny little follow-up on that. Just a question on, are there any other communication rules or theories in particular that you abide by and think are worth looking into?
Yeah, the one that I live by is something called the 3% rule, which is that 3% of the people drive 90% of the conversations in organizations. This is particularly true when you get to larger organizations. There's a lot of work that's been done around internal influence, social mapping, organizational network analysis, snowball analysis, call it what you will. If you're in an organizational communications position, there is immense value if you can get the organization to allow it to start to investigate who people are talking with in the organization. In fact, this is what I wrote my book, From Lincoln to LinkedIn, the 55-minute guide to social communication about, which is really about identifying the groups of people that drive your business. And that's not just necessarily the functions that appear on the organizational chart, but also the networks, the tribes, the communities of like-minded people, people of similar age groups, similar ethnic backgrounds, similar locations, similar educational backgrounds, intakes into the organization that create the invisible networks that actually drive communication and culture.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you both very much. We're going to move on to the last question, and I'm going to let both of you answer, or whoever feels free to jump in. So go for it. Here it goes. People are often dissatisfied with the information they receive regarding other offices. Do you have any tips on how to bridge geographical gaps? And at what point, size-wise, does a company realize they can't know everything that happens in another office?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's probably one of the most common issues in terms of just the globalization that we're seeing with many businesses. I mean, for us, it was really just about identifying, as I say, through those focus groups, what content was really useful for people to know and what they wanted to hear about from other offices. And so we took two different approaches to that. So we have some static content, which is very much kind of operational about who's in which office, which is it's one of those kind of self-serve things. So if and when you need to find the information about a particular office that you want to visit or that you're just curious about, that information is there, and we have owners that make sure that that's always kept up to date. And then there's the more dynamic, conversational, time-bound communications, which we've built channels around. And so that's really up to individuals, again, to go and sign up, subscribe to the channels that they are interested in knowing about. And so I think it's really just about having the information there in a way that's easy for people to access, but in a way that gives them the ability to tune in and out of the things that's most relevant for them.
I'd also look at the credibility of the people representing the individual locations, that you want to have different locations represented in different ways. So instead of there just being, say, a weekly report from the HR assistant at location number 2, you have voices of managers who are located at location number 2, staff who are located at location number 2, so that it presents a more rounded picture of what's going on at location number 2 and how location number 2 fits into the picture at the other locations and the overall global picture. Because you can get very siloed in the way you can communicate, and you may focus more on efficiency than effectiveness. What I find is effective is the use of multiple sources and making sure that different locations are represented in whatever global communications you do.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much for the input. That's all the time that we have for the questions that we have left. There are a couple we didn't get the chance to answer. I would like to suggest, please, if anybody has any questions left or anything that they would like answered by either Natalie or Mike, please feel free to tweet at Happeo HQ, and I will make sure that one of them gets back to you with a relevant answer. In the meantime, I would like to remind everybody that I would like to remind everybody, sorry, that we have a monthly podcast. We have a collection of curated internal comms articles and my client's research, all present on happeo.com/community. So I would love to see you all there. And yeah, thank you very much for attending the webinar. Mike, Natalie, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us tonight.
Welcome. Thanks for having us.
My pleasure.
Fantastic. And I wish everyone a good evening. And if you're overseas or in the States, as we would say, a very good rest of the day. Thank you very much.